The scent of lemon polish clung to Olivia's sleeve like a memory she couldn't shake. She worked the rag in slow, practiced circles, watching the mahogany swallow and return the light, thinking of small things, how a baby's breath smelled after a feed, the way her son kicked when she hummed a lullaby, the thin silver band of sunlight that always found the high point of the table and set it on fire for a moment. The dining room felt bigger than it should have, as if the ceiling had been extended to hold all the secrets that house kept. The chairs were low and patient, the crystal waited like bottled promises. She had been hired 3 weeks earlier as part of a larger staff rotation, cleaning, a little cooking, tending to the houseplants, and the money had been enough to keep her and Ryan afloat. It wasn't safety, but it was a place where people didn't ask questions about small bruises. He appeared like a shadow at the doorway at first, tall, shoulders that could have crushed a man in an empty room, but moved as if the world was an object he calibrated rather than controlled. Olivia stiffened without meaning to. She knew the stories. The name alone opened muted spaces in city gossip. Victor Castellano had a way of filling rooms that wasn't showy and wasn't loud. It was an effect of sharp angles and a stare that wandered like a compass. He had been in the house once before, briefly, to inspect things, but this time his hand rested on the doorframe, and the afternoon light drew a thin line across the scar by his temple, like a notation someone had made on a ledger. "Who touched you?" he asked. The words landed as a clean, impossible question, and it cut the air in a way that made every other sound seem foreign. Olivia felt the color drain from her face even before she answered. The man across the room, Maroney, had been insistent that day in a way that made her skin crawl. He had come through the front door with the easy smugness of a man who presumed consent was a formality. He'd laughed too loud in the kitchen, his palm had lingered at the small of her back, and when he'd moved too close to where Ryan slept in his carrier, Olivia had felt something flip inside her, a switch set to danger. She managed to guide him out with practiced calm. The world had taught her how to remove a predator with a smile and a decline, how to make polite refusal shield a child from the fact of her own fear. But he had touched her, and even that small contact pressed against old, remembered hands, Jack's hands, the way they had used anger like punctuation. Victor's questions stripped time down until it was only the now and the truth sitting between them. Olivia started. The tremor in her voice subtly dissipated. She didn't want to show the tremor. She had been steady for Ryan for 10 months, and steadiness had become its own muscle. Her voice compressed into a whisper. "I guessed. He touched my arm. He got too close." Victor's eyes narrowed, not in cruelty, but in consideration. He stepped into the room as if he had always belonged to its shadows and light. "Bring him back," he said to the empty air, and the house answered. A door opened somewhere, and Maroney, who had been leaning against a marble pillar, straightened. The man tried a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't long before his confidence was undone by a steady set of footsteps and Angelo's voice. Angelo, the head of security, moved like a machine that felt feelings only in calibrated bursts, obedience, focus, and an underlayer Olivia had learned to trust. He was the kind of man you hoped never to need, the kind who made you feel inexplicably safer just by existing between danger and the child asleep at your feet. Maroney's exit was quiet enough that the maids didn't look up from their work, but there was a hum afterwards, an aftersound of something else being handled, a small tidy of power. Victor watched Olivia the whole time, assessing the way her jaw set, how her fingers pressed the rag until the knuckles hinted white. There was a question in his gaze that wasn't interrogation, but it wasn't entirely consolation either. He had seen a lot that did not look good for other people and decided which bits deserved action. "Sit," he said, finally, as if their distance were impractical and the room wanted them closer for something important. She obeyed because he said it, and because anger and tiredness had conspired to make her legs soft. She hadn't meant to be dramatic in front of anyone, especially not in front of him. That was the dangerous part of being visible. Someone could take you and rewrite the story of what you were and what you weren't. He sat across from her. Between them, the table reflected a world in miniature. The chandelier, the careful silver, a book that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "You have a child," he said, and the sentence hung like a small, well-placed stone. Olivia looked at the rag in her hand, and then down at the bag where Ryan's soft scarf peered out. 10 months, she said. Victor's jaw worked, as if deciding the value of a currency only his particular mind could compute. "If you want help," he said, "I can give you protection." The phrase moved over her like an electric current. Protection. It was a word with teeth and warmth. She had been living off the existing term they had, a safe place, but protection implied an architecture, a plan, people who didn't have to be convinced, withdrawal of options for those who might hunt her. For the price of her silence, for the price of a visible tie to him, she could sleep without checking the locks. "Payment?" Olivia asked, because transactions were the things she knew how to arrange. Victor's smile was a soft, unfamiliar thing. "None that matters, not for what you need." He folded his hands. "But if I'm going to give you cover, it has to look right from the outside. We will pretend publicly that you are engaged to me. That will close certain doors." A million small, sensible alarms rang in her chest. Pretend? Engagement? Being paraded as a trophy? She'd seen that story before and how it ended up in magazines with gilded photos that never showed where the bruises had been. She pictured Ryan sitting in a high chair under lights, a baby's laugh captured and used to sell an idea. Her hand tightened on the rag until the polish left a wet crescent on her palm. "I'm not your actor," she said. "You'll never have to be," Victor answered. The sentence was designed to be simpler than it sounded. "Just be present. We tell a story." He looked at her then, and his eyes lost their cool for half a breath, and something older, tired, human glinted there. "You retain custody. You decide how much you share. I despise being used for show. This will be the least of that. I will ensure no one pulls Ryan into that world." She tested him with distance for a moment, tapering suspicion into economy. "Why would you do that?" He set his palms on the table and leaned in, and for the first time Olivia tasted confession in the air. "Because someone touched someone I care about once," he said, in a voice small enough that it was almost a secret. "And I do not forgive that." The offer was a map. Olivia could read routes on it. Safe streets, locked doors, a name that made people step aside. But she knew the other side of the map, what being shielded by a man like Victor meant. Lives wrapped in rumor, helpers who expected loyalty in return, laws bent for expediency. It was a different kind of cage from the one she had left. It would be ornate and warm, and terrifying in its own geometry. For Ryan's sake, she swallowed the big reasons and let logic guide the rest. She had no family to take her in, no father to beat a fist on a courthouse door. Jack Thornton had left his mark not just on her skin, but on the state's memory. She had an open case and a judge who moved like molasses. She thought of the nights she woke up, hands fumbling for a crying baby and a phone that had been silent for hours. She thought of the time a man had tried to barge into the apartment below theirs, and she had made herself very small and very invisible while Ryan slept. "If I accept, I will need terms," she said. He inclined his head like a man used to mysteries needing signatures. "You will. Name them." She took a breath. "I keep custody. I work on terms I approve. My privacy is honored. No press on my history. I will not be put in any position that obligates me to perform sexual favors. My decisions about Ryan's care are mine, and she paused because the last one mattered most. If you ever threaten me with your world as punishment, I walk. He listened, his face a study and calm. Olivia watched for the flicker of ego, the twitch that often betrayed men of power when their will met another will. It didn't come. Instead, he nodded carefully, as if noting the contract. Agreed, he said. No coercion, no pressure. You will have a nanny you choose. I will provide staff. We will explain nothing beyond we are engaged publicly. There will be rehearsals. You may keep working until it feels unstable. He folded his fingers, then unrolled them. One more thing. Her shoulders braced. What? I don't offer shelter as repentance. I offer it as arrangement. You tell me the lines, and I will deliver the walls. But if you betray my trust, if you betray the audiences we manufacture, I will act to protect the performance. The sentence didn't suggest violence. His meaning was more political and absolute. I will make sure the city believes the story I need them to believe. Olivia swallowed. She had traded for safety before. The currency had been fear. This currency was different, but the ledger could tilt either way. She imagined headlines and lawyers, and the slow, slow work of a life unspooling the minute someone decided to take a pin to it. Deal, she said. The word tasted like something heavy and inevitable, and as she said it, she understood why people made bargains with men like him. They bought minutes, maybe years. They bought a chance to breathe. She had a child who would not understand the complexity of the transaction. He would only need a bed that was not locked from the outside, and a mother who could sleep without checking the peephole every hour. After that, things happened in a way that felt both sudden and fitfully normal. There were meetings in rooms that smelled of new leather, where Victor explained the parameters. There were discreet phone calls to people with clean hands and the authority to arrange flights, to transfer funds, to start the slow choreography of a public relationship. Angelo took measurements of the nursery to determine where cameras could be sparing and unobtrusive. Olivia was introduced to Maria, Sophie, and Valentina, the women who brought humanity into the house's machine. Maria, with her blunt humor and a knack for folding sheets so that corners fit like promises. Sophie, who smelled of lavender and had a laugh like a shared secret. Valentina, who watched Olivia with such clear compassion that the younger woman felt seen and not studied. The mansion itself was a fortress gilded in habit. Its walls held the city's many quiet currencies, art bought for investment, books that hadn't been opened since the year they were delivered. The nursery Victor gave them was painted a warm, neutral gray. A white crib with simple bars sat near a window that looked out over a garden trimmed to military precision. There was a soundproofing quality to the rooms that let the city fall away. Yet there were cameras in the corners of rooms, not in the nursery but in hallways, the sort of surveillance that made privacy a negotiated term rather than a birthright. Ryan slept differently here, or maybe Olivia did. She arranged his blanket, watched him breathe, and felt the world shifted in a dimension she could not yet name. Victor did not intrude. He left the small domestic tasks to others, but he would come by sometimes, standing a respectable distance from the crib, watching as if noticing the poetry in the curl of a sleeping child's fingers. Those moments were disconcerting, like watching someone catalog a thing they had never allowed themselves to touch. He would ask the smallest, precise questions about feeding schedules or how Olivia preferred the laundry to be done, and when she answered, he would make a notation that satisfied him. Olivia found herself teaching Sophie to make formula the way she did, correcting the nanny when a burp needed a different angle, instilling in these women a cadence of care that felt like handing down a torch. She withheld nothing about Ryan's needs. She shared everything that made him his small, particular person. That was a place where she refused to be sold. She was not a prop in a show where her child could be moved on cue. She had been given a map, yes, but she would always be the one to read it. Yet the house's opulence pressed against her like a constant humidity. It wrapped around small moments, feeding, bathing, reading, and made them feel performative simply because of the way others suspected them. Maria would whistle while folding Ryan's onesies, and the sound made Olivia ache with the normalcy she had not allowed herself in months. Victor noticed those small normalcies the way a gardener notices a plant that has found the sun. A little surprised, a little relieved. They rehearsed the story with a meticulous, almost cold kindness. Victor taught her how to walk with him in public, arm placement, the angle of the head, where to place her hands on a microphone when a camera was near. He did not over-direct. He corrected with a whisper, an adjustment as delicate as the tightening of a thread. "Relax your shoulders by an inch," he'd say. "Look at the people, not at the cameras." It was a craft he seemed to have acquired by living under observation for years, the ability to be seen without being dissected. "You want me to believe you?" she asked once, in the kitchen, with steam curling from a pot and the smell of basil softening the edges of the house. He watched her, and for a moment the thing between them wasn't a script. "I want you safe," he said. "What happens after that will be whatever it wants to be." She thought of Jack, the way he had owned her attention like a commodity, the way his aim was to undermine. The thought hardened something protective in her. She wanted safety for Ryan, but for herself she wanted autonomy. Victor's promise had a clause written in the tone of his voice, a willingness to keep his hands off what she declared hers. Days folded into a new rhythm. Angelo's team ran checks on routes to the daycare they ultimately approved, and a nanny was chosen who smelled of chamomile and knew how to quiet a baby with the kindness of someone who had once been small herself. Victor gave Olivia a small ring as part of the charade, a band of dull, substantial gold that would photograph well. He didn't force it on her. He asked if she would accept it. She did, more to close a door than to open one. When he slid the ring onto her finger, it wasn't a fairy tale gesture, and it wasn't hollow. It felt like the way a surgeon seals a wound, practical, necessary, clinical. For the first night she slept without waking at every creak, the ring on her finger felt like armor. The city, in its way, was a living thing that loved spectacle. Victor's name on one arm and a small nurse who smelled only faintly of bleach on the other was a tableau that excited the gossip columns and quieted certain predators. It moved like tidewater. Some people recoiled and others leaned in. Olivia, who had spent months learning how to balance fear with everyday tasks, felt her private life rearrange into public pieces. Interviews minimized to fashionable photo shoots, the occasional carefully curated social media posts that showed her holding Ryan at some charity event while Victor, removed yet visible, stood protectively near. Her private victories felt small and enormous. The night Ryan took his first toothless grin in that house, she found herself laughing as she had not in a long time. Victor, who had been watching from the doorway, smiled in a way that reached his eyes and did not try to own the moment. "He's lucky," he told her. "He's got you." "I know," she said, and it was the purest, most undirected truth in the world. But even as security tightened, other things nudged at the edges. Gossip had its teeth, too. Someone always wanted the inside of a house like Victor's as much as they wanted to break into it. A note here, a whisper there. Maria found odd receipts in the second drawer that didn't match Bill's. Sophie once noticed an unfamiliar driver near the staff entrance late at night and wrote it off as an error until Victor's face showed a flicker she hadn't thought to have seen. Olivia, who had been trained by life to notice the smallest anomalies, started noticing things she had been taught to ignore. The house hummed with watchfulness, and in that hum she heard the city's curiosity like a buzzing insect just outside a window that had been left ajar. They had a dress rehearsal in the mansion's music room for the charity gala where they would be photographed for the governor's dinner. Lights were arranged to flatter. A dress that cost more than Olivia's apartment had ever been worth hung against a door like a new identity. There was a photographer with a steady hand who directed them to laugh where laughter was expected, and to look at each other as if they were the most natural pair in a long, picturesque lineage. She practiced scanning a crowd and finding the face of someone she loved. It felt foreign and then fragilely possible. Not everyone believed in the manufactured story. Some of the house's staff knew enough of Victor to know that protection never existed without strings. Some of them, like Valentina, watched Olivia like a sister they wouldn't sacrifice. They leaned in and helped with discreet lessons in how to wear heels without wincing, how to make a phrase sound like intimacy rather than a line learned for a scene. The women exchanged confidences in the laundry room, passing each other stories like lifelines. Olivia found herself telling a little of the truth about Jack, about needing steady paychecks, because that circle required small honesty to hold. Then, toward the end of a week that felt like it was being pressed into a single long photograph, Victor called her into his study. He rarely used that room for flights of intimacy. It was a room of maps and quiet decisions, and as Olivia crossed the rug, the air smelled of old paper and the faint, warming spice of coffee someone else had brewed. "I have something to show you," he said. She braced herself, imagining files that named names, documents that could topple reputations. She had learned in fragments that the city's battles were often waged on black and white paper. Victor had resources. He had people who could find the thin seam of truth inside a fat liar. He slid a folder across the desk. It made a soft, decisive thump. Olivia opened it with hands that didn't shake, which surprised her. Inside were bank statements, lined, neat, and photographs of transfers that didn't match the official ledger entries she had seen in the sparse court papers she had sometimes read in bad light. There were marked dates. There were totals that multiplied into numbers that smelled of theft. "Jack Thornton's foundation," Victor said. "Not the charitable part you see at galas, the private accounts that feed other things." Olivia felt the room tilt, not toward vindication, toward a new, complicated axis. This was leverage, and leverage could be weaponized for many ends. The facts were plausible. Some men hid small glaciers beneath the public smiles they kept. If Victor held those papers, he had moved beyond theater into a place where the city's voice could be reshaped. If exposed, those numbers would make the Thornton name a liability, and a father, Richard Thornton, who lived in a world where reputation bought doors, would have to choose what to defend. "What would you do with them?" Olivia asked, because the obvious answers were always the most dangerous. He looked at her without flinch. "I don't need to kill him to make him disappear," he said. "Shame has a currency. I can offer his father a simple choice: quiet the son and ensure his future outside the city, or let the ledger leak and watch the family burn in court and press. He will sacrifice what he can if the cost of public exposure is too high." Olivia's hands clenched. She understood the logic of men who removed obstacles without leaving bodies. The world had laws, and it had men like Victor who bent the world around those laws until a door somewhere closed. "You're going to blackmail them," she said, and it was less an accusation than a naming. "I am forcing a political decision," he corrected. "It is not elegant, but what I want is your child safe at home with you, not a man whose hands remember how to punish." Olivia read the papers again, seeing numbers and dates and the way a careful pattern assembled into evidence. She had to decide how complicit she wanted to be in the next moves. If Richard Thornton had influence, then he might exile Jack rather than accept scandal. If that happened, a child would lose a father in an unclean way, but sometimes tragedies had to be redirected to save other lives. She pressed her thumb into the margin of the paper until she made a crescent-shaped mark. "And if his father refuses?" she asked. Victor's face sharpened. The gentleness dropped away like a curtain. Then I make the ledger public and let the city do what it will. Reputation is an engine, Olivia. It will run on what it is fed. She thought of the moral ledger she had weighed in the dark of nights, how to buy safety for one life without ruining another. Her answer would not come from simplicity. It would come from the equation of probability and fear and a mother's reflex that measured which harms were survivable. "I won't be a silent partner in cruelty," she said at last. She meant it. She would not be the thing his plan could weaponize without her consent. "If you look for leverage, I will be told every step. I will hold a say. I don't sign away my right to know how you use the papers." He studied her and nodded slowly. "You will have knowledge. I promised you autonomy." He hesitated, then added, "But once we move, the city will look for fissures. People will probe. Keep nothing you don't want found in stale places. Your past is yours to carry, Olivia. I'll carry the rest." She left the study with the folder pressed to her like a pulse. Outside, the sky had acquired an odd city gray. The house felt less a sanctuary than a machine that had turned and now hummed with a new purpose. In one hand, she held the evidence that could ruin a life. In the other, the ring that could be used to sell her to 1,000 imaginations. People are not pictures on walls, she reminded herself. They are mutable. They can change if you give them the space. She would steer herself through this. She would keep Ryan close and make rules, hard rules, for what went into the public eye. The choice was ugly in the ways choices are when you must trade one harm to prevent another. But for the first time since Jack had left, she had leverage of her own, not in papers, but in decisions, small, stubborn sovereigns of the self that she would not sell. That evening, as twilight bled through the curtains and the house shifted into the hush of domestic hours, Olivia bathed Ryan in a plastic tub that had slippers of foam to keep him from sliding. He giggled and spit water in a spray that caught the light like a burst of tiny stars. Victor watched from the doorway, closer and yet contained in the doorway, as if there were a line he did not cross unless invited. His face was less a mask than a carefully composed thing with edges. "He's beautiful," Victor said finally. "He's loud," Olivia corrected, with the kind of laugh that made her eyes water. It was small and a little fierce, and in it lived the knowledge that she could make joy even in the middle of bargains. "Good," he said. "You will need that sound in the world." They fell into an easy silence that was not intimacy, but not distance either. Outside, a car drove past the gates, and the gravel barked like an animal warning. The mansion, with its gilded rooms and careful staff, was starting to become a place where lives would be rehearsed. The city would watch. The city would gossip. The city's curiosity would sharpen. Somewhere, somebody made a note. Deals were rows of dominoes. You pushed one and nothing was isolated for long. The ledger Victor kept pressed to his palm, the camera angles the photographer planned, the ring that hugged Olivia's finger, these were pieces of a net being cast. When Olivia lay down that night, beside Ryan in a small, borrowed room that smells now of lavender and lemon and new leather, she felt the weight not as heaviness, but as a peculiar steadiness. She had asked for terms. She had been given them. And still the world outside whispered to the edges. She closed her eyes and counted the small, ordinary things. Her son's breath, the soft tick of the clock, the steady vibration of a home that could be a shelter if she kept its seams intact. Then, 2 nights later, a message arrived at the house without sender. An anonymous note slipped into the servant's basket. It contained 1 sentence and a photograph. The photograph showed a man in a suit at a downtown bar, raising a glass and laughing with people whose names she recognized from old, fear-scarred memories. Jack Thornton looked lighter and more dangerous because he had a grin that belonged to privilege and an ease that had once been his way of making threats invisible. The sentence on the note was precise. You can't hide from what you once were. Olivia read it twice and then 3 times. Her stomach hollowed like something had been pulled out of her. She folded the paper and smoothed it and kept it like a talisman against denial. She had a new house and a ring on her finger and a folder of ledgers somewhere that could unmake men. She also had the truth that some people never went away unless you made them. She had chosen a battlefield, painted in public optics, but battle meant skirmishes, and sometimes people carried knives on the sides where cameras couldn't see. She put the photograph in her pocket and wrapped Ryan closer. She would tell Victor. She would insist they move faster. She would ask for more security for the staff entrances and a thorough vetting of everyone who had access to the house's laundry lists. She would make demands. She had promised to be part of decisions. She would not be silent. That, she reminded herself, was part of what surviving had meant. Outside the gates, a pair of headlights faded into the night. The city stretched beyond, hungry and bright and indifferent. Inside, a ring fit snug at the base of a finger that would, in time, learn to hold both the smallness of a child's hand and the weight of a public story. If you love suspenseful romantic thrillers, hit subscribe to follow Olivia's story. Olivia slept poorly that night, as if the house had become a cathedral of small alarms. When morning pulled at the curtains, she woke with the photograph folded into the pocket of her robe like a coin she could not spend. Ryan fussed in the bassinet, and she rose because she had the muscle memory of motherhood burned into her bones. The photograph could wait, so could fear, until it could not. At breakfast, she found Victor in the library, a cup of coffee untouched at his elbow, and the folder she had last seen on his desk closed like a small secret. He looked up when she entered, and there was an expectant stillness in him that had nothing to do with social niceties. "You look like you haven't slept," he observed. "Someone left a photograph in the servant's basket," she said, blunt and quick. She did not fashion a story around it. She placed the paper on the heavy wood between them. Victor smoothed it with the flat of one hand as if it were brittle. He did not ask who had left it. He already knew the city's habit of anonymous threats. Instead, his voice went low and methodical, the way Angelo spoke when modeling a plan. "Show me everything you've received since the house began taking on your routine." Olivia handed him the other notes, small, petty things, a receipt thumbed through and returned, a whisper recounted by Maria's cousin, a text message from an unknown number asking whether she enjoyed the new life. The pile looked like the messy underbelly of a conspiracy rather than evidence of a single man's ire. Victor read each by himself and filed the anger of it inward. "We will increase the screening of people who access the property," he said finally. "Staff, deliveries, visitors, no exceptions." "You mean more cameras," Olivia replied, and her tone did not soften. She had boundaries. Cameras in corridors might register a face, but they would also make a home feel like a stage. "I agreed to surveillance because it felt like trade, not because I wanted to live in a fishbowl." He nodded, not as one yielding, but as someone cataloging a trade. "We will move cameras from the nursery hall to the outer perimeter. Angelo will double background checks. I'm placing a buffer team, people who can watch without having to file public reports." "It has to be discreet," she said, "and it can't feel like punishment to the staff. We need to treat everyone with dignity. If you go heavy-handed, you'll make enemies inside these walls." He considered that and then smiled, small and genuine. "You want them treated like people," he said. "That will be part of the rule book." Olivia gave him a look that implied the conversation was not yet concluded. Also, no embarrassment of Jack in public, unless we've prepared for the fallout. If you plan to force the family's hand with their money, I need to know exactly how you'll use the ledger. I am not your silent partner in ruin." He nodded again. "You will see every move. You will have veto power when it's reasonable. I promised you autonomy." She let out a breath. The ring on her finger felt heavier in that moment, less a symbol than a thermometer measuring pressure. She left the library with a list of small demands, and Angelo met her on the steps with the efficient expression of someone switching modes. "There's an unfamiliar car by the staff entrance last night," Angelo said without preamble. "It left at 2 a.m. We tracked the plate. The driver is registered to a muscle for hire who has done work for the Thornton estate." "You think it's connected?" Olivia asked, suddenly sharp with a taste of adrenaline. "Not proof," Angelo allowed, "but it's a lead. We've also found a comm link used to ping the house's staff keypad from outside. Someone had a copy." Who had access to the keypad? The question was trained and practical. Olivia wanted names, not theories. Angelo listed them: Maria, Sophie, Valentina, 2 laundry contractors, the grounds supervisor. He watched Olivia as he spoke. "One of them might be compromised. The others may be innocent. We'll proceed without sweeping judgments." That afternoon, they began soft interviews, quick, private conversations that felt less like interrogations and more like being asked to recount one's life in ordinary language. Maria cried when she said she had no family to go to and could not afford to lose this job. Valentina watched Olivia with raw tenderness and grudging strength. Sophie was shy at first, but then fierce when it came to Ryan. "You come into my life, and I will not let anyone harm him," she said. And Olivia wanted to hug her for the bravery in such small language. It was Sophie who found the clue that rewired the investigation. While fraying a seam in the laundry room, she discovered a slip of paper tucked into a box of linens, a small printout with a timestamp and a driver's number. It was marked in shorthand the way a contractor marks work orders. Sophie, who had a memory for faces and a habit of cataloging deliveries, recognized the service van from nights she had put the bins outside. She described it to Angelo and to Victor, who leaned forward at the description like a man tracking the last thread of a frayed rope. "Good," Victor said. "We cross-reference. We see who had access the night before the photograph was left. We run every phone that touched the staff keypad that week. Quietly." "Quietly," Olivia repeated. She liked that word. Quiet meant the world would not tremble, and that they would at least try to protect the dignity of people who did not deserve to be dragged into a public ill. Days shrank into a steady motion of rehearsals and vetting. Every social face Victor and Olivia practiced together became less like acting and more an exercise in trust, small rituals that taught bodies how to mirror one another. Still, Olivia could not shake the feeling of being on a ledge, hair blowing in wind. The photograph in her pocket seemed to weigh the way a memory does, pressing warmth and threat into the same place. The gala came sooner than she liked. It was held in a conservatory whose glass gave the city to the sky like a theater box. She had a dress that made her feel both visible and armored, its color an honest, deep green that suited Ryan's eyes and did not scream for attention. Cameras angled their lenses like questions. Victor's hand was steady at her lower back as they entered. His other hand adjusted a cuff with a practiced motion. Jack Thornton arrived as every man of privilege arrives, already owning the room with the casual arrogance of entitlement. He moved through the crowd like someone who believed the city's courtesies belonged to him by inheritance. When his eyes found Olivia, they skittered like a map trying to find the old route. He smiled, a practiced, poisonous smile, and for a second Olivia felt the old muscle of fear twitch inside her. But this time there were lights and witnesses, and most importantly, a man at her side who did not look away. Jack made an approach, because men like him did, and because he wanted to remind the city he could still cross any threshold. Victor did not let the conversation become private. He maneuvered them into a space where the press could see, a small, conscious theater of inclusion, and then he spoke with a voice measured like a legal deposition. "Olivia," Jack said, with a tone crafted to unbalance. "Good evening, Mr. Thornton," she replied. Her voice was steady. She had rehearsed like this, short, clear, no tremor. The cameras loved short answers. They loved the feeling of a story that could be snipped and shaped. They would publish it either way. Jack's smile thinned. "I see you've made improvements," he said. "The city's full of second acts, isn't it?" Victor's response was a small, civil tilt. People make decisions to protect what matters to them. Olivia and Ryan deserve that. The exchange spread through the room like a scent. Rumors rippled. People leaned in. The fact that Jack had approached and been visibly sidelined fed the story. But what no one in the crowd could see was the conversation that followed in a private alcove, where Victor and Angelo sat with a quiet, strategic violence. "We have him," Victor said simply. "He came tonight to test the span of the story." Angelo supplied the facts. They had tracked a car to a contact who worked for a third-party vendor that had indicated a Thornton payment. There was circumstantial proof that someone had been probing the house. "Do we make the ledger public?" Angelo asked. He sounded like a man discussing surgical options rather than a scandal. Victor's eyes were flat. "Not yet. We need to be strategic. If we release too soon, we'll be accused of manufacturing a hit. If we wait too long, someone could strike while the ledger is under wraps. We need to force Richard Thornton's hand quietly." "Meaning?" Angelo asked. "Meaning we give him a choice he understands, a private presentation, a discreet ultimatum. We show him the numbers, lay out how it will be interpreted by the press and the prosecutors, and give him a clean exit for his son." "But will he accept exile?" Angelo wondered. "He loves his name." "Reputation buys more than pride, Angelo," Victor said. "It buys doors. Richard will make the transaction that keeps his doors open." Olivia insisted on attending the meeting when Victor suggested it, which surprised even him. She would not be a bystander in decisions that affected her life. The study felt warmer than usual when she entered. Victor sat her down and handed her a chair, as if she were equally part of the machinery. "This is the moment you told me you'd be included in," he said, and he slid the ledger across the desk. The papers were the same she had seen before, cleaned and organized to be persuasive to a banker or a prosecutor. She read the figures again, slower this time, trying to make the numbers into human narratives she could live with. "I won't weaponize this to humiliate a family," she said, because she meant it. "If you present this, you present it as a way to secure Ryan's safety. You don't leak it to ruin." Victor nodded. "You choose the line." She thought about the child Jack had once been, someone who had been taught to measure power by dominance, and then about Ryan, who deserved a chance to grow without fear. She said, "We present it as evidence of embezzlement tied to funding that supported Jack's lifestyle. We ask Richard to remove his son from the city, to sign a document waiving custody claims while the matter is investigated, and to place Jack's income into a trust controlled by a third party for the child's maintenance off any political platform. Make it legal and neat enough that a judge or a family attorney would see the wisdom in it as a way to avoid a public collapse." Victor watched her, impressed by the clean, pragmatic way she described legal maneuvering without pomp. "You make it a bargain for the child's welfare," he observed. "Less revenge, more removal." "Exactly," Olivia said. "If they choose public exposure, I want the city to understand the ledger is why. But we give Richard a dignified out first." They prepared the presentation like a hostage negotiation that required civility. Angelo arranged for an intermediary, an old friend of Victor's who handled matters in the shadows, but with a legal mind. He was careful to be legal adjacent rather than illegal, a fixer who understood how to frame a choice so it felt less like coercion and more like sound counsel. The intermediary would speak with Richard alone, presenting the ledger and the potential fallout with quiet professionalism. The day they met in a private room at a neutral club, Richard Thornton arrived like a man armored in linen and the belief that money insulated him from shame. He took in the room with a calm that implied this conversation was routine. He did not rise in anger. His primary weapon was the patient patience of an elder who had navigated worse. The intermediary was precise. He laid out the financial trail and then the social map. Press reactions, likely parliamentary inquiries into the foundation, donors who would pull back, and the legal risks for a family that could not easily cash out their reputation. He spoke less in threats and more in ledgered consequences, numbers and optics that Richard understood. Richard's face folded in ways that the press had never photographed. He did not deny the arithmetic's plausibility outright. He asked for time, which the intermediary denied politely. "Time favors the public," he said. "You can either control the narrative privately or let it control you publicly." In the end, Richard made the howl of a man choosing damage control. He called his son and ordered him to leave the city for a period while the family reorganized. He agreed to sign a document that would make the legal relinquishment of custody a path less messy, a private agreement with the promise that the arrangement would be filed in civil court as part of a settlement if necessary. It was not a perfect legal erasure, no private meeting could ensure that, but it was enough for a family intent on buying back dignity. Jack's removal was quiet on the surface. He left that week with a duffel bag and a face that looked both confused and furious. The press found him soon enough. They photographed his car as it left the drive and indulged in the theater of a man who had been exiled. The city's gossip columns smelled blood, but Victor had ensured the papers would find narration in private. He had made Richard choose family reputation over his son's presence in the city. That was a moral bargain, ugly as it was tidy. When the story leaked to the press, because in cities secrets do not remain secret, the account took a curious shape. Victor Castellano had quietly forced the Thornton family to remove their son after allegations of embezzlement tied to suspicious transfers. The press spun it as a mysterious businessman taking on the city's pillars. People loved the narrative of a shadow man who could quiet a scandal with a watchful eye. Olivia read the headlines with a complicated knot in her stomach. The city learned the secret in the way the title had promised, publicly. There was a particular thrill to reading that which proved the ledger existed, that which showed how reputations could be used as currency. But there was also shame. It made the moment feel like a ledger itself, lines of credit and debit between lives. Jack's father did what Richard had promised. He negotiated terms. Jack was sent to a seaside town where his father had relatives. He was given a trust fund and a small annulment of his public claims for a time. The legalities were messy. There would be hearings and lawyers and press reports for weeks. But for the immediate present, Ryan's name did not appear in those stories. The bargaining had, oddly, kept the child out of direct media exposure. The night Victor told Olivia what he had done, it was not with triumph. They met alone in the music room where the shadows pooled friendly and the piano sat silent. "He's gone," he said simply. She processed the words slowly. "Quietly sent away," she corrected. No miracle. There was no sparkle in her voice, only the sober measurement of a woman assessing whether the world had shifted enough that she could breathe. He nodded. "He will not be a presence in the city for a while. It's not permanent justice. It's a tactic." "Was it worth it?" Olivia asked. She demanded something of him, not mere explanation, but reckoning. "Did you feel victorious?" he supplied. He did not look offended. No, the victory tastes like a neutralized bomb. Something stopped ticking. Olivia felt the weariness of him then, a man who had spent years manipulating spaces for safety and had learned the cost of each hand he closed. "You didn't make him disappear violently," she said, affirming one of the hard lines he had offered. "You forced a social exit." He allowed himself a half-smile. "I kept a promise. You were included. You had input." She remembered the night she had agreed, and the clause she'd insisted upon, knowledge and veto where reasonable. He had kept that. Her chest eased little by little. It was a good day, she said finally, because it was good enough, where survival had been the metric. The engagement party came a week after Jack left, planned by a publicist who worked in whispered triumphant lines and set pieces. It was to be both a celebration and a statement. Victor and Olivia would stand before the city's movers and be photographed as a couple whose alliance protected a child, and who, in turn, had the right to protect themselves. It was the kind of scene the tabloids loved because it combined power, beauty, and the faint odor of redemption. Olivia dressed in a gown that felt more like armor than costume. It had sleeves that allowed her to hold Ryan without exposing too much of her chest to gossip. She had rehearsed her smile until it felt natural, but inside her there was an unease that was not fear and not excitement, but the guileless tension of someone walking a tightrope. The room thrummed as guests arrived. The governor and his wife were there, as were donors who had once funded charities in which the Thorntons had been prominent. There were cameras, yes, but there were also people who wanted to measure every step of her. Olivia moved like a woman who had learned to keep her hips steady. She let Victor guide her by the elbow and smiled when the cameras demanded it. Halfway into the evening, a hush fell because a reporter had slipped a note into the program, a new twist, and a hush always makes guests lean toward spectacle. A man at a podium began to speak about civic responsibility in a way that was perfunctory, and then, to the crowd's surprise, pivoted. He spoke in calm, deliberate tones about accountability, about the ways in which public funds were sometimes misdirected, and how private inquiry had unearthed irregularities. Olivia felt the room tilt as heads turned toward Victor. Her pulse tripled when the reporter, one Victor had chosen for his professionalism and discretion, produced a copy of the ledger and waved it like a banner that did not sting, but it clarified. "These documents were brought to us by parties concerned with public trust," he said. "We will ensure the proper authorities review them." There was a ripple, some guests frozen, others whispering. Olivia watched Richard Thornton in the crowd. He looked at the unfolding scene with the expression of a man counting the cost in real time. His face had gone pale. The governor shifted, as governors do when their social constellations are rearranged. Victor did not shout. He didn't have to. He had already forced Richard into a private decision, and the public display was a tidy reminder of authority. The city, hungry for a story, ate its portion of scandal. The moment then became personal in a small way. Victor drew Olivia aside to a balcony where the city glittered like a distant congregation. He spoke softly. "You were right to insist on dignity," he said. "I staged this so it wouldn't be raw humiliation." "It felt like a public trial," she said, and the words came out like a confession. "I didn't want Ryan dragged into that. I wanted us to be careful." "And you were," he said. He took her hand, gently, and she did not pull away. "Thank you for choosing to be involved. For keeping your terms." She studied him. For months, he had been a man of calculated moves, always measured, a protector whose kindness was often spelled in strategies. There had been a human cost to his methods, friends estranged, favors asked, but in those moments, his vulnerability surfaced. A man who had learned to use the language of protection to amass a solitude he now offered to someone else. You never told me why it mattered so much to you, Olivia said suddenly. It was not a reproach, it was a need to know. People become more real when you know why their hearts flame. Victor inhaled as if readying a truth to place between them. He looked out at the city, and for a moment his features softened, losing the precise edges they'd worn. When I was young, someone I loved was touched and nothing happened, he said. No one fixed the thing. It broke her life in slow ways, and I saw how the system lets people fall through. I promised then I'd be the kind of man who would close hands on danger before it began. That's how I learned to operate. Protection felt like atonement. Olivia felt the tenderness of his confession like heat. That doesn't make you a savior, she said. It makes you complicated. And it makes me careful, he replied. I don't want to use my hands on you or Ryan. I want to use them to make a world where you can choose what to do next without fear. She looked at him, searching the place between his careful armor and his earnestness. She had started this arrangement as a transaction, and now found she needed to understand the man it had entailed. She found a softness in him that the thresholds of the mansion had not yet eroded. I have my own reasons for not wanting him around, she said, thinking of Jack. But I also want to make sure I'm not just taking refuge under someone else's umbrella. I have a life to build. You will build it, he said. I will not. He paused, choosing the right word like a man picking the right tool. Impose. The rain had started, thread-like against the glass. He leaned closer like the world had narrowed to the balcony and the hush. When he kissed her, it was gentle and consensual, an inquiry rather than an ownership. She answered because something in her folded toward shelter, but he did not take possession of the moment. He pressed his forehead to hers afterward and said, with the soft bewilderment of someone touching a new possibility, I like you, Olivia. Not as a story, not as a shield. I like you. Those words trembled in the space between them, a promise without guarantee. Olivia let herself feel the flutter of something she had been taught to mistrust and to value. I like you too, she said, and it was honest and small, and it did not pretend to be everything. The weeks that followed were not an easy fairy tale. They were negotiations of house rules, of privacy, of press queries and lawyerly letters. The public had dislodged one secret and not the rest. The Thornton scandal became a season of headlines, but the particulars of her life remained private by mutual agreement. Jack's capacity to make direct claims against custody diminished as he left the city and entered a parallel life of distance. Family courts often prefer stability, and an absent father who is out of the city's reach is not an appetizing litigant for immediate custody changes. Victor provided legal resources and retained counsel, had crafted a plan where Olivia's guardianship and ability to care for Ryan would not be eroded by the sorts of knee-jerk challenges she'd feared. There were hearings, yes, procedures that required time and patience and a steady hand. Olivia testified once before a private family mediator, giving a measured account of the abuses she had suffered without sensationalizing. The mediator recommended a temporary order that supported Olivia's primary custody due to Jack's absence and the volatile family situation. A legal settlement ensued. Terms were set for Jack's guardianship payments to be handled by a trust directing funds to Ryan's needs, with the mother as the primary guardian, and a court review in a year. It was not absolute closure, it was plausible and realistic, a pause that allowed her and Ryan to breathe. The city had learned its headlines, and people talked less in whispers and more in the curious, transactional language of gossip. The staff of the mansion grew into a small, loyal community, each person bonded by the shared knowledge that they had been treated with respect, even as their lives became public by association. Olivia found herself at the center of a small domestic circuit. Maria's blunt humor, Valentina's protective warmth, Sophie's soft competence. They became her safety net of ordinary human things, folded napkins, late-night coffees, shared laughter over a child's tantrum. Victor kept his hands off the things she declared hers. He did not intervene when she insisted Ryan eat a certain way, or when she rejected a stylist's idea that made her feel like a living mannequin. He listened when she wanted to keep the oddities of their private lives just that, private. The marriage of power and tenderness he offered had limits she had set and he respected. There were nights when he came by the nursery and watched Ryan sleep, and those nights felt less like surveillance and more like reverence. Olivia would watch from the doorway and see a man humbled in the presence of a child. It changed the geometry of her feelings, not that they blossomed instantly into love, but they shifted into a cautious curiosity that allowed softness. Angelo remained a presence, silent and precise. He had lines he would not cross, and Olivia respected him for that. They developed a short language, a look, a gesture. He showed her the staff rotation plans and the ways he kept redundancy in their security measures without making the house into a prison. She trusted him. Trust was a thing earned in small increments. Sophie once knocked on Olivia's door late one night with a bag of leftover pastries and a story about her sister's baby. Olivia pulled her in for tea and listened to the way the young woman described motherhood without melodrama, with a simple, fierce affection that reminded Olivia of how close everyday love could be. They traded small confidences like currency. Olivia began to feel toward the other women in the house a tenderness that belonged to chosen families, people she would protect because she liked how they made ordinary life bloom. As the city moved on, another headline, another scandal, Olivia began small experiments in the life she could build. She went back to part-time work at a clinic that handled vaccinations for neighborhood children. It gave her both purpose and a sense of reclaiming a profession she loved before fear had narrowed her world. She arranged her hours so Ryan could nap and Sophie could be on staff. It felt like an act of assertion rather than bravado. She could enter public service and still protect her family. Victor watched her, pleased in a way that did not demand narration. He congratulated her quietly when she returned to nursing. He did not make her story his project. Instead, he provided the infrastructure that let her walk the path she chose. Their intimacy evolved by degrees. There were small moments, a phone call from Victor in the middle of the day with a silly observation about a painting, the way he cooked a simple, steady stew for dinner when she had a difficult day. He told her about a childhood memory, an afternoon when, as a boy, he had hidden in a stairwell and listened to adults making decisions that carved other people's lives. He was careful, again, with his confessions. He never used them as currency. He offered them as context. "Why me?" she asked once, late and honest. It was not vanity in the question. It was confusion about the way a protector's attention had landed upon her life. "Because you are unadorned by pretense," he said. "Because you do not seek to play a part. Because you make yourself responsible to another life, and that steadies me in ways I did not expect. You are not a trophy. You are a person who chose." People do not change overnight, and both of them bore histories. But the ritual of choosing to be kind in ordinary ways built a fragile architecture of trust. They had dinner parties that were carefully planned and then improvised, quiet evenings by the fire, and mornings where they shared the ritual of letting Ryan crawl between them on the rug. She watched him teach Ryan to stack blocks, patient and slow. The leak in the household was solved quietly. A ground supervisor who'd been coerced by outsiders into allowing a driver a one-night pass had been quietly reprimanded and given the safe choice of a different job that kept him away from perimeter access. Victor paid him an allowance for the time he would wait to transition, and the man accepted. Olivia felt the ripples of that choice. No punishment for the man, but a firm re-establishment of safety. Justice, in the way the house implemented it, favored repair and protection over public crucifixion. It matched the contract Olivia had insisted upon. When the year rounded toward the court review, a small tribunal convened and a judge, a woman who had been assigned by the family court bench because she had a reputation for clarity and fairness, read their file. She asked direct questions about the child's welfare, the stability of housing, and the presence of the father. Jack's absence, the private settlement, and Olivia's work all weighed in the ledger the judge kept, less a black and white judgment and more a practical balancing of facts. In the end, the court reissued a primary custody order to Olivia with a scheduled review. She did not crow. She let the quiet satisfaction of being believed set in. On the night the order came through, Olivia took Ryan out to the garden and let him crawl on the patterned stone beneath wisteria. Victor joined them, and for a long while none of them spoke. The city was a distant glow beyond the high hedges. Night insects hummed like an audience indifferent to the private theater of their small family. "You did well," Victor said finally, and it was not a command but a compliment. "So did we," Olivia replied. She said the word with ownership. The "we" included the staff and the legal team and the solidarity of women who had listened to her stories. It included the small finances and the self-protection she'd learned to assert. It included the fact she had asked for terms and had been part of the bargaining. He moved closer and kissed her, and this time the kiss held a different weight, less the careful testing of a protector's affection and more the first acceptance of partnership. It was tender, and it made her think of a life that could expand beyond survival. It did not erase the past, nor did it pretend that anything was solved for good. It simply acknowledged a new willingness to be present. As the city adjusted its narrative about who she was, a woman who had been protected, who navigated scandal with dignity, who now worked in a clinic and cared for a child, Olivia found herself letting down guardrails in measured ways. She took a walk down to the neighborhood market with Ryan and a small cloth bag. People recognized her and offered kind words. Some remembered her from before, others only knew the headline versions. She smiled when it felt right, and declined to answer when she needed quiet. Victor did not appear as a man who had all the answers. He appeared more human, a complex protector who made mistakes, apologized when he crossed lines, and deferred to her when she demanded her boundaries. Olivia derived a small but steady comfort from that pattern. He did not use power as a default. He used it in service of the rules she helped craft. The city, too, had to make sense of the secret it had been shown. Journalists wrote features that varied from admiring profiles of a shadow man defending a nurse and her child to critical takes that wondered about the use of private power to solve public problems. They debated the ethics of using reputational threat as leverage. Protesters and commentators had arguments. The Thornton name lost some sheen and acquired a cautious distance from public charity panels. But amid the swirl, ordinary life regrew its small shoots. Olivia planted herbs in pots along the kitchen window with Selfie, who had become a trusted friend. Maria taught Ryan to eke with a spoon. Valentina introduced them to a neighborhood baker who made the best buns. They celebrated small victories, Ryan's first steps in the hallway, a letter of appreciation from the clinic for Olivia's work with mothers, Victor attending a play at the community theater with a table of people who did not move to avoid him. What had begun as a transaction transformed into a fragile companionship, not the shiny romance magazines sought to catalog, but something more skeletal and honest, an alliance based on mutual need, respect, and the slow accrual of tenderness. One afternoon, months later, when the city had stopped leaning into the Thornton story as its main course, Olivia walked into Victor's study with a bag of seeds she had bought for the garden. He looked up from a ledger and smiled at her, the way a man smiles when the world is less fractured than earlier. "They sprout best in spring," she said, offering the packet. He accepted it and stood, dusting his hands as if to be useful. "Then we plant in spring," he said. They knelt together in a patch behind the nursery, hands in the dirt, and Ryan watched from the grass, rolling a small ball with a determined prehensile grip. Victor taught him to press the seeds gently into the soil, and Olivia watched him show the boy something that did not require muscle but care. When they finished, they sat back on the step and let the sun warm their faces. For a long moment there was silence, and it was not empty but companionable. "Do you ever regret the way we started?" Olivia asked, not in accusation, but in the reflective way one talks about an old injury. Victor thought for a while. "I regret the parts where I didn't ask if my methods would hurt you," he admitted. "I regret that you had to trade something for shelter. I don't regret that we did what we did to keep Ryan safe, but I do regret the collateral hurt, and I try not to cause more." She nodded. "That's all I wanted to hear." "And I have tried to let you make the choices you want," he added. "I know power can erase people when it's wielded without consent." She looked at him, and there was an honesty in him she had come to trust. She reached and took his hand, a small act, ordinary and decisive. He did not hesitate. The grip between them was not possessive, but a mutual choosing. The city continued to churn, full of its contradictions and appetites, but in the small theater of their lives, a new equilibrium had formed. Olivia had moved from hiding to living, from fear to cautious curiosity. Victor had moved from solitary control to a practice of deference that cost him pride. And Ryan, small and unstoppable, ran between them, bridging the gap with his own simple gravity. There would be more challenges: court reviews, the occasional spiteful article, the ongoing work of making a home in public. There would be the moral calculus of the choices they'd made. But that night, as they sat on the porch, with Ryan asleep and the city's lights distant, Olivia felt the thin, hopeful sense of a life being rebuilt on terms she helped construct. When the headlines finally receded into the scroll of city memory, people started telling a different story about her. Not a victim, not a trophy, but a woman who had navigated a dangerous sea with a child's hand in hers, and who had, in the process, redefined the shape of protection. The city's shocking secrets had been exposed and mediated. Reputations had shifted. The Thornton family had been forced into choices that prioritized image over closeness. The price paid by each party was clear. The Thorntons lost their public innocence, and Jack lost his claim to immediacy. Victor had to weigh whether his methods had cured or only deferred danger. Olivia had given up anonymity, but kept her agency. At the edge of the night, Victor and Olivia sat in quiet and made an agreement that felt like progress. They would not let the house become the only place they lived. They would take walks in the city, accept dinners with people who saw them as people, and keep the small rituals that made a life ordinary. They would not pretend the past was gone. They would simply choose to live despite it. As dawn hinted on the horizon, Olivia let her head rest on Victor's shoulder for a breath that had nothing to do with bargaining or strategy. It was the kind of peacefulness that followed a long battle, thin, fragile, and real. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who loves a slow-burning, suspenseful romance, and watch the next chapter to see what happens after the city learns the truth.